Welcome to GovCon Unscripted, where we dive into the unfiltered stories and strategies from all around the world of government contracting. Join host Chelsea Roberts as she explores how to navigate, thrive, and win in this complex but lucrative industry.
Welcome to GovCon Unscripted. This is your host, Chelsea Roberts. Today's episode is a part of a series that we're calling Success After Service. We're featuring brilliant minds with wisdom to share from throughout the federal ecosystem, folks that served in the military and have transitioned out and found some success after their time, either in federal or military service. I hope that you enjoy this episode and the series, and if you haven't yet, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast with your friends. All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back to GovCon Unscripted. I'm your host, Chelsea Roberts, CEO of Collaborative Compositions. Today, I've got with us Gene Moran, President of Capital Integration. Gene, who are you and what do you do?
Who am I? Chelsea, good to be with you. I am President of Capital Integration, as you suggest. I help companies achieve dramatic outcomes in Washington, D.C.
And that is a very broad statement. So why don't you give us a little bit more insight into what exactly that entails?
Yeah, so that's the purpose. It does make you wonder, how does he do that? I help show companies where the rest of the playing field is. Most companies are leaving 30 to 40% of the government playing field uncovered. And you wouldn't play any sort of game with leaving 30% of the field uncovered. Most commonly, I find that people really don't have an understanding of what the congressional role is in this process. That's not the only piece, but they do play an integral role. And I try to help companies see how industry, agency, and Congress integrate and how they should have some connection points to that constellation of decision makers in those three rings.
Now, I think some people might call that lobbying. Is that what you call it?
There's a line between where does business development stop and where does lobbying start? And the definitions are pretty clear and defined by the Supreme Court. When you get to a certain level of seniority, even in the executive branch, you are lobbying. There are a lot of business people who communicate regularly with political appointees and flag and general officers, and they don't recognize that's actually lobbying. Lobbying is when you're trying to influence an outcome within a government situation. In Congress, the rules are slightly different in that pretty much if you're communicating with anybody in Congress, staffer or an elected member, you are lobbying. But it is a tool in the toolbox to know how to communicate effectively across the river, as I like to say in DC, the Pentagon side and the Capitol Hill side.
And now that's pretty in-depth and fairly interesting because I think that a lot of people miss that nuance between having the conversation on a political side and having just a conversation with their typical government customer. What's the line and where's that line delineated between communicating in a lobbying way and communicating just with a government customer on any other basis?
There are some more subtleties to it. Generally, the rule of how much time one spends performing those sorts of activities, that's generally defined as 20%. If you're in business and spending more than 20% of your time on those kinds of activities, that is full-blown lobbying. If there are multiple conversations about the same topic, hoping to achieve the same outcome, generally that's two conversations, that's lobbying. We can call it whatever we want and we can register or not, but we're trying to make the same things happen. We're trying to tilt the playing field in our favor. We're trying to create great outcomes for the government, but we want to try to make sure that every voice gets heard. I think it's wrong to suggest that, and I'm not saying you do, but there are people who suggest that the executive branch comes up with its budget and that should be the plan and we should all execute that. The process doesn't allow for every voice to be heard in that way. Congress is an avenue where other voices can be heard. It happens a little bit later in the process. And I have found in PhD research and public policy that focused on defense executives' understanding of the Washington space that the overwhelming number just don't understand how this puzzle fits together.
And I might even count myself as a part of that because my understanding of how the puzzle fits together is surely much more surface level than anything that you've had and had the experience to dive into. So, how do you help companies, and what's the typical size of company that you're helping to make big moves in DC?
I can help small, medium, and large because they're going up against the same process. So I present myself as a process expert. I understand how the government determines what its budget should be from all aspects of it. I understand where the change points are, where the approach points are. Some call those access points. Helping a company get its message in line with the government process is a major part of any sort of sales process. But it's often missed because people tend to have a very specific understanding of the process, whether it's the contracting piece, the acquisition piece. Some understand the congressional piece. Over my decades long career now, seeing the approach from multiple vantage points and have worked in those areas. So if I can help a company tighten its message up so that they can say it very succinctly, and I don't mean an elevator pitch, but to align a presentation to an identified need that the government has, but you have to present that at the right place and the right time. Often companies stumble into their first contract, they get lucky, and then they don't know how to repeat it. And that's what my book Cleared Hot is all about, is how do you sustain those wins? But if you recognize that there are opportunities in the executive branch and in Congress and with your industry partners at certain times in the year for specific fiscal years, you can have real influence. If you show up at the wrong place and time, you'll have a nice meeting. Nobody will tell you no, and you'll go on your way and think things are fine. And then you'll learn that they're not.
And I think that's probably the reality of many people right now in this environment that we're in, which is a somewhat protracted government shutdown. And it doesn't seem like there's necessarily any end coming to that anytime soon. How are people still able to make moves, have decisions made? Is anything changing, happening in DC right now from the top level?
Yeah, we could break that down a couple of ways. If you look at government over the last couple of decades, full appropriations across all of government have not happened on time since 1996. So the fact that we're in some sort of a disturbance right now in the fourth quarter of the calendar year is business as usual, believe it or not. It has a different reason for feeling like this, and we are, quote, shut down. However, there is money moving. There are authorities in place. We just read that Secretary Noem was able to acquire two G650 jets. The White House is being reconstructed. Money is going to those needs. There are authorities in the reconciliation money that's available that extend out to 2029. There is a problem, though, with who's in the desk to be able to move paper and write checks. That is a disruption, and it's a reality. So I don't mean to trivialize that at all. We are in a prolonged period, is my prediction, of government by exception, where the executive branch is testing every boundary that was once an established norm or even a policy. And in some cases, law is being challenged. We can take a political position on that. I'm not here to do that. In the nature of my work, I walk down the middle. But the reality is that the rules that applied just 5 years ago, just 1 year ago, are being challenged. And so you can either accept that things are changing, or you can dig in and say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. The smart companies are figuring out how to maneuver in this changing current.
And how are they doing that? What are some things that you're seeing companies that are being successful right now? What are they doing?
Not to take the extreme position, but if you look at the Mag 10 tech leaders, they were on the other side of the line during the last administration. They shifted quickly, not for ideological reasons, but for business reasons. They understood they needed to demonstrate to the president and to the administration that they were on board. I'm not suggesting that we all need to go out and stroke $1 million check to the inaugural fund or the presidential library, but we do need to communicate that we're a willing partner and that we want to be part of the solution. Our providing of a product or service goes to that next level. So if you get to the operator level, or if you get to what is the capability we're delivering, I think that's where you need to focus in order to rationalize, how do I have communications with people who I might not agree with? I do it all the time. I have to do it all the time because parties change and party dynamics change. And that is how the system was designed. We're seeing exceptions to it. We're seeing things tested, but showing up, being willing to communicate, not having chips on your shoulder. Obviously, you need to conform with the law. The president can challenge the law, contractors cannot. So I think being willing to show up and have open communications to the maximum degree that the government is allowing right now. And frankly, in a lot of cases, they're not answering the phones. It doesn't mean that they're not in the office. Some are using it as a foil to not have to respond to some of the chaos. Frankly, there are people in very senior positions who are walking on eggshells because they're not quite sure what their new authorities are. And they're being expected to make things happen, but they don't know how far they can go or how much they're allowed to change.
I think that there's, at least in my experience, I've seen a diverse spectrum of personalities within the government sector, and having folks that are absolutely willing to toe the line, to test their boundaries, to go out of their way to be unusually helpful, or to put themselves into a position to continue and provide excellent communication and ultimately get the warfighter what it needs. But I've also seen the other side of that, where there's folks that do leverage things like the shutdown as a reason to hold back and to keep themselves isolated and insulated from any blowback they might get from either side, from their leadership or from industry and the industry that they're trying to serve. So I think that it's challenging to, especially for small and mid-sized businesses, to find those people that are open and still eager to be the best government customer possible and to be the best steward of taxpayer dollars in during times like a shutdown, because it seems like there's probably a lot fewer of them given all the rifts. They're a lot harder to find because there's so many others that are just crowding out the space of not wanting to let them in the door, not wanting to answer the phone, not trying to give them the time of day because they have some fear of reprisal. So I think that it's important that folks remember that there are people out there that are still doing their jobs, that are still actively advocating for small businesses, for midsize, for government contracting industry as a whole, to continue to provide and to continue to support the warfighter needs, and not just the warfighter, but everyday American needs as well. On the Fed Civ side, I think it's really important that people remember that those advocates and those people are still out there and things are still happening. It's not just a complete dead stop for everybody. I think a lot of people perceive it to be in the shutdown.
I co-wrote a book with Alan Weiss called $1 Million Influence. And a part of that book was about recognizing that coming straight in the front door with your issue is not always the best approach. Sometimes you need to find the side door, find the people who influence or enable decision making. And it may not be the immediate person that you think. There could be other approach points to those people that you're trying to communicate with. Today, we hear of some government employees up on signal chats with contractors. They're not technically allowed to do that, but if there's a degree of customer intimacy that already existed and underlying trust that goes with that, some are more comfortable than others to do that. In other cases, the government employee is just not allowed to use their government email and they're complying with the law. As we're getting at, now is not the time to be developing your customer intimacy. That needs to be in place. And how one develops that over time, it's a very individual thing. It's different for different program offices. Different agencies have different perspectives on how much they want to communicate with industry. It fascinates me to hear when somebody says, I know Admiral Jones, or I know Congresswoman Smith. And the key is not do you know them, but do they know you? And do they understand what you do and what your company provides? And so many never get to that level of mutual understanding about what the other one does. Sometimes that's because a company is so new to the environment, they haven't had time to develop that. Most are constrained by bandwidth. They simply don't have the ability to cover down on the multiple relationships across this constellation I referred to of the industry, agency, and Congress. There are cases where it makes sense to outsource some of that sort of support. Some are just penny wise and pound foolish in that they say, I can't afford to do that. I say you can't afford not to make those sort of investments to get the ROI that you need. The ROI is 10x, 50x, 100x. In federal, those are realities. You can have huge returns on relationships that you contract for. And over time, you can develop those relationships of your own or transfer those relationships and see real success. But many companies are operating on one operating plan, one program office, trying to see what else they can sell into that program office. And they really need to diversify to align to different lines of the budget. That's how you diversify in government sales.
And now I'm assuming you're not talking about just the folks that, they say, if you got a problem, reach out to your representative.
Some people do that. And the problem is Congress doesn't tell us how to best communicate with them. And so you almost have to have been on the inside to understand how to communicate effectively with them. And that means showing up at the right place and time with the message that's dialed in that they can do something with. So for me, that is a single page white paper, not a lengthy presentation or PowerPoint deck, a single piece of paper that has 4 parts. The issue, what's the problem? The background, how did we get here? The discussion, why does your solution make sense? And a recommendation which ties a specific budget line to the solution. Money needs to move here to do this to provide an outcome. If you can do that in under 8 minutes, you have a chance if you're showing up at the right time. But what I see are companies inviting their member of Congress to their facility at an odd time in the cycle, and they might think they're going to show them around, and then at the end, they're going to jump them with an answer to the how can I help you question. And it's just at a time when it doesn't make sense. The fiscal year budgets move in a specific way. And so you need to be touching them in the right place at the right time. So right now, FY26 is still held up on the hill. If you're asking Congress about something for FY27, you're early. That window will open January through March of this year, regardless of what the status of the budget is. The FY28 budget is being developed right now within executive branch agencies. FY27 is out of the hands of the program offices right now. Some people are still trying to influence that at the PM level. It's out of their hands. Nothing can be done. So these are just examples of being at the right place and time with the right message. It sounds so basic, but alignment is a fundamental issue that I deal with when bringing a new prospect into my client base.
Yeah, and I think that for some companies, darn near impossible to conceive of the fact that everybody's schedules and all of the budgeting process and the obligation process and the POM process, they all have different but in sync cycles, and they all have periods in which it is more appropriate to go discuss these things with some folks higher on the hill and some folks down at the program office level. And it's different times that they have to be tracking, that they've got to be aware of. And it's not just a simple, whenever you're having a problem, call your representative and complain to their office and hope something gets done. There's actual points in the process where it makes sense and things can be done to help you and to help enable your company's success. And I think that's constantly overlooked.
It seems so simple. I like to say that this process is very learnable, but most don't have the bandwidth to just sit down and learn it. They don't take a course. They don't read books about it, but they could learn this. You don't have to go do it for 20 years and be at different parts of the government process. I've had that benefit just over time, but not everybody does, and it's just better to learn it from somebody else. The overwhelming number of executives that I interviewed in my dissertation research rely on their networks that they came into their company with. They don't invest in themselves further. They typically don't do things that would really grow their network outside of the lane that they're generally in. They might go to trade shows, but they're going to the trade show to sell their thing. And they're not necessarily going to a different kind of trade show where they might grow new business because they don't have time for that. I go to things like the Consumer Electronics Show by Southwest. There are a lot of adjacent events at those shows, and they're very big. They're much bigger than defense, obviously, but I do it to immerse in new things and learn new things. I have the capability to do that. A lot of smaller companies may not.
I think a lot of smaller companies, it may be as simple as having some self-limiting beliefs, but they don't believe that they've got the power or the time or the luxury of working the approach from both top down and bottom up. And I think a lot of companies start with bottom up, which is we've got an end user who is like really jazzed about our product or service. They really want to get it into their hands. They want their friends to be able to use it, but they've got very little sway or stakeholder voice in the process. They ultimately are just providing their inputs into a much greater and much larger process that only takes into consideration their voice in small amounts and only to some extent that they really can see. And it ultimately comes down to we have an end user that they really want it. So somehow magically from that end user's desire, their product's going to end up in the bigger overall top-down budget. And that becomes a problem with companies not realizing that a lot of the budget process and a lot of the ownership of budget comes from top down, and it comes from bigger desired need and bigger needs that are expressed from a higher level than things that companies are just pushing up from the end user basis and from the end user stakeholder standpoint, which I don't see end users going and talking to their congressional leaders. I don't see end users having one-on-one conversation with their congressperson trying to get their need, their requirement into the budget. It comes from a much higher level than the end user who's got the need at the basic user level.
I have found that process awareness is just a major gap. An overwhelming number of executives and senior executives in many cases, even at very well-known companies, people pretty high up have not taken the time to really learn how to approach and who they can approach and how they might be more creative in how they develop their contact plan or engagement plan.
Now, I think it's probably a common feeling amongst, especially small businesses, probably a lot of mid-sized businesses too, that they can't afford to build relationships at every level. They can't afford to spread themselves so thin as to approach the entire spectrum of government customers from top down, bottom up, and have any success there. What's your thoughts on that?
If you lack process awareness, then you generally lack imagination to be able to see what different outcomes might be available. After a while, companies may get tired of being outmaneuvered by the competition and actually take the time to see what are they doing differently. The most successful companies are covering down on these various access points. We were talking about lobbying at the top. It doesn't have to be about lobbying, but it's no secret that the top 200 most successful federal contractors incorporate lobbying into their planning. They are large companies. When you're talking about the top 200, the smallest on that list is above $1 billion in revenue. $1 billion is about the break point where it makes sense to have a full-time office in Washington, D.C. to cover both congressional and executive branch efforts. But below that $1 billion mark, it actually makes more sense to outsource some of those activities. And as I said, the return on the investment is substantial. It outweighs any return that anything else in the business is producing. But if you lack awareness, you just don't know and you can't see it. And I try to say this is very learnable, but you do have to make the effort. You have to be introduced to somebody who can teach it to you. And there are all sorts of GovCon resources out there, all sorts. And it's hard to know where to start if you're only drawing on the intel that your narrow network provides. You're probably going to be suboptimized for a very long time.
Now, you've developed some of those educational resources. We were talking earlier about you've got a couple of ebooks. Tell us a little bit about what you've written on.
Yeah, I did it starting in 2019. I recognized that I'll back up a bit. The reason I've been working independently for the last 12 plus years now, I'm in my 13th year, is because when I was a lobbyist in corporate after my active duty Navy time, I recognized when companies came to Washington for supplier days. And I got to see every vertical. At the time, I was working for DRS Technologies. They're now Leonardo DRS. They supply to every major platform. So all the supplier days would bring CEOs of companies to town. And I got to recognize, wow, a lot of these people don't really understand what the current state of play is. And they're totally reliant on what the primes are telling them, which is often partially correct, but it may not be the full story. So I saw this opportunity to help other companies that need to have better information to try to navigate some of these spaces. So as I said, I've been doing that for over 12 years. But a few years into it, I recognized, hey, I think I know enough to write a book about this. And that's when I wrote Pitching the Big Top, How to Master the Three-Ring Circus of Federal Sales. That continues to be a bestseller today because it's meant to be so simple and be an airplane read for an executive. But then I have a couple of commercially published books. Government Deals Are Funded, Not Sold is based on my academic research. It's the only academic research that exists on the defense executives' perspectives on lobbying. I confirmed a condition that is quite painful, and most really don't understand what they're up against. But it's something they can do something about. That book, Government Deals Are Funded, Not Sold, does explain a lot of the things we're talking about. I've done some ebooks that are intended to be super simple to read, a listicle format and a couple of graphics and images. One of them is Ziplining Through the Valley of Death. One that is just released this month is Cleared Hot. These are just simple checklists to make sure you double check your plan against what you think. And if you pick up one thing out of a $10 book, it could make a big difference for you. Capital Currency is an online program. It's a unique program because it does integrate congressional and executive branch engagement, but it's over 70 modules of me communicating just like this in 5-minute segments and 30-minute segments about very specific aspects of the process. It has downloadable checklists. There's an accompanying paperback book that comes with it. So it's meant to be a multimodal delivery for people who process information in different ways. There's pictures, there's words, there's video, there's the book. Those are just some of my tools that I use as ways to help companies who are not quite ready for me. And there are a lot who aren't ready for the kind of support that I can provide because they're cash starved or they're just sustaining on one program. I help companies that are in the budget or on the cusp of a budget. They're about to go from SBIR Phase 3 into a program of record. When you're in a program of record, the game changes completely about what can be done. How do you tell the story about readiness or cost savings? And it's a different conversation than the, hey, I've got a new idea conversation.
I think that is probably one of the most common misconceptions of small, mid-sized companies that are doing R&D, that are in the SBIR process, that the conversation kind of stays the same and that they're just being exposed to a microverse or a microcosm of a bigger picture, and they just can speak louder and say the same message to all the people within the program office if they want to be considered for a program of record from where they are, which is on the other side of the valley of death, which is creating things for R&D and stuck in that R&D prototype cycle and trying to just capture that small percentage of funding that's available. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see companies make that are trying to cross that chasm?
We touched on lack of imagination. If you have no contract and somebody offers you $100,000 for something, that sounds like great money. And if you do that a couple of times, suddenly you're making more money in revenue than you've ever seen before. We're talking about the very small startup here. But you could stay there for 20 years doing that over and over. And every year we hear the SBIR program is going to go away, the massive reform coming. It will be adjusted and it should be adjusted, but it won't go away because it's too important to the overall national security. There are other ways that companies can think about how they're delivering value. And as I said, if you can't imagine that you might be able to get a conversation with somebody who really does have the throw weight to move the needle and make a top-down decision to say, hey guys, we are going in the wrong direction. And here's why, because I just learned about this capability that's within 6 months of being ready for delivery. But if you're too afraid to make that approach, or you don't think that you can get contact with those people, or that game is for the big guys, I don't want to be a partner with a big prime, you're self-limiting and closing doors right from the start. In the commercial world, it's very common for a company, before it even starts, for a founder anyway, to know what the exit strategy is going to be. Am I going to spend 5 years at this, or am I building the next Amazon? What is the vision? Most have an idea of what the exit strategy is. For those that take investment, the investors definitely don't enter without understanding what the exit strategy is. Too many companies approach the government sale thinking that, oh, it's $1 trillion budget. I just need my little crumb from that and I'm going to be okay. That's just small-minded thinking. You really need to be thinking about what's the value you're bringing to that end user. What does the business case really look like? Most haven't really spent the time on the strategic plan required to think those things through. They're not always fun exercises, and it might help you come to the conclusion that there's no opportunity here and I shouldn't be pursuing this. Sometimes that is the answer.
That is undoubtedly hard for some to hear and for some to find out, especially if they've taken an exorbitant amount of time to try to figure out that's the conclusion for themselves and to get to the point where they're realizing that there's no opportunity there. I think that it can take a lot of time to come to that decision. If you are spinning in circles, if you're trying to continuously play in the smaller field and not really put yourself into the position of recognizing the entire playing field and what all decisions go into making any dollar move within the federal government. There are decisions that have points throughout the decision process, throughout different players and layers, if you will, of who's involved. So I think having the awareness and being able to recognize, okay, I'm thinking too small. I'm at a point where I'm self-limiting. I need to open myself up to some creative and maybe unique ways of accessing people that are making decisions that are going to impact my business. I think that they can come to that decision a lot quicker and they can find that they've got a lot more action or value out of having made that decision if they can ultimately move a little bit faster and being able to open up their brain and think about things a little bit differently than the way that they've always thought about it. I think it goes back to that old paradigm of the way we've always done it is not going to get us to where we want to go. It's going to take a change and a shift.
I'll offer just a couple of examples. I know we're up on time here. In the uncrewed space, unmanned drones, surface, undersea, there's been a gold rush underway. And that gold rush has been unfolding for several years now. There are companies still clamoring to get into that space. It's a saturated space now. There may not be an opportunity there, and we're only going to choose so many winners in each domain. It may be that the current policies don't support what your solution set might be, or it's already been figured out. Where those people would do better is to try to figure out or help the government figure out, what are you going to use these uncrewed systems for? Because there are capabilities that some of those systems could be used for that haven't been figured out yet, but they're hard problems to solve. I'm talking about things like seabed mapping or weather processing. There are real needs that are not being met. The other gold rush right now is in AI. I get approached every week by an AI company that's got something that they think the government has to have, and they haven't quite figured out that the government doesn't yet know what it's going to do with AI. They're adopting it incrementally, as are we all, but they haven't quite figured out their place in that ecosystem. They just know there's a lot of money going there. Lastly, on the service provider side, I had a conversation yesterday with a service provider, a long-standing company in California. They've been in business for over 30 years, family-owned, tens of millions in revenue, half of which goes to government sales through GSA channels. And we had a conversation about, are you potentially at an inflection point where you need to be thinking about, when does this sort of technology that you're selling no longer relevant? And are you going to be ready for that? Because it's going to happen on your watch. This is a young guy who's now running the family business. So this won't be relevant in 20 years. How are you going to pivot what you're doing in sales through those channels now to something that might better serve the enterprise? And it just pulled back the curtain that, hey, your strategy is flawed and you're riding a wave right now that isn't going to last forever. Those are difficult conversations, but if you don't have them, you will go out of business for the reason every company goes out of business. They run out of cash at some point, and it's just a reality.
Now, I think that's a point in which a lot of our audience and listeners can take to heart and really realize that there will come a time that if you don't change your approach, if you don't adapt and pivot accordingly, and you don't take the next step towards growing and becoming the next version or the next iteration of what you are, what your company will be, then you will be left behind. You will be held back. And those are those self-limiting beliefs that I think we were talking about a little bit earlier. Gene, I'm sure everybody that is listening into this is going to want to get a hold of you. How can they do that?
I have a website, genemoran.com. I'm happy to answer questions. You can download Cleared Hot. That's a free downloadable ebook. It pops up on the website. When you go to the website, you can email me directly at gene@capitalintegration.com. That's capital with an O. I do run a couple of seminars, two per year. I'm doing one in DC next week. This will be after this airs. It's called the DC Reset, where we're acknowledging, hey, the world has changed, and I'm bringing CEOs into the room to talk about how can we stress test our underlying strategy to make sure that we're taking advantage of these new opportunities. I do another one in May called Meet the Ringmasters. I do that in Sarasota, Florida. Happens to be home of the Ringling Museum, but it's also a play on my book, Pitching the Big Top, How to Master the Three-Ring Circus of Federal Sales. I bring leaders together in a very intimate environment, 12 to 15 people, and we challenge each other with how we're approaching this government opportunity. So it's a place where a curated group is outside of their comfort zone and outside of their normal network. The common thread is that I brought them into the room, and it's a way for people to look at their problem differently and come away rejuvenated and with some new ideas that they can take into their teams that are implementable within weeks if they come to those sort of realizations.
And that sounds like fantastic opportunities, exclusive, I'm sure, and invite only, but it sounds like for those folks that get to participate, that's a fantastic opportunity for them to take that wisdom that they can gain from the top other executives that have other ideas and get out of their own echo chamber of where they currently live and play their business. You're also pretty active on LinkedIn and socials, is that right?
I am, and that's really just to be a presence out there. You have to be in the public square, as they say. Alan Weiss is famous for using that term. But I think people buy based on what they know and see in an environment. I'm in a service delivery business. At the end of the day, every one of my clients comes from some form of referral, usually from some layer of my network. LinkedIn is a way to keep my brand in people's mind. I try to keep it educational. Sometimes it's meant to be humorous. It's not too heavy. I do talk about things in some of my weekly newsletter that gets produced or reproduced on LinkedIn that are outside of just straight up sales. They might be about leadership. They might be about life. They might be about travel, books, but it's meant to be helpful to people who are in busy roles and don't have a lot of time to spend on these things.
I love that. I've loved all of your content, especially as of late. It's very quick, easy to digest, and gets me to the point where I'm curious and want to know more, and encourages me to reach out to you and get a better sense as to what's going on and how you're approaching your solutions and how others approach it. So I think that's a great resource for folks that are out there. Sign up for the newsletter, get that coming to your email, and see it on LinkedIn as well. Gene, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your time, and I think you've shared some valuable pieces of insights and information for folks in the audience. I really appreciate your time, and ultimately like, share, subscribe with your friends. Make sure everybody else is getting this episode and every other episode of GovCon Unscripted. And we'll see you here next week on the show. Appreciate it, Gene.
Keep up the great work, Chelsea. Good to be with you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of GovCon Unscripted with your host, Chelsea Roberts. Do you have a GovCon story or need guidance in government contracting? Connect with Chelsea on LinkedIn to be a guest on the show or to enhance your business strategy. Don't forget, your network is your net worth. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with your growing GovCon community.